Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculo's True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Michael A. Bryan, and joining me today is my amazing friend and Horary Astrologer Extraordinaire, Tony Lewis. Tony, welcome to the show again.
Great to be here.
Anything interesting that you've been doing just in your practice or in terms of astrology lately?
Well, I'm a perpetual student, so I keep exploring things.
Uh-huh.
In terms of horary, recently I've been interested in, for a long time, but recently I've been doing some charts that Evangeline Adams had done or using her method on various charts, and it's quite fascinating.
I never had made the connection between Evangeline Adams and Horary Astrology, but when you said it to me, I went back into her literature and I saw what she wrote, and she was really, really amazing. I mean, the whole concept of it, where I think the quote was that people can come in for a horary consultation back to back, and they'd pretty much get the same reading from the Horary Astrologer. So that was her justification for using the natal planets of those two different people within the angles of the horary moment in order to give them their individual readings. And I found that so fascinating. So thank you, Tony, for introducing me to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a fascinating thing, and the more I work with it, the more fascinating it gets. I mean, I think I mentioned to you, I had read that Rudolph Valentino was like a heartthrob superstar of the 20s. And he fell ill. The exact moment that he fell ill was recorded in the newspapers. And then apparently they asked Evangeline Adams, who was a leading astrologer in New York at the time, what she thought would happen. And allegedly she predicted his death to within hours of when it occurred.
Wow.
So I wondered how she did that. I looked in Karen Christino's book. She wrote an excellent book documenting Adams' life and her works. And unfortunately, we don't have a record of how she did it. So what Karen thought was that she probably used a decumbrature chart. She probably set up a chart for the moment he fell ill and analyzed it. But then it occurred to me, Adams didn't practice traditional horary. So what she must have done was taken Valentino's birth planets and put them in the decumbrature chart, just the cusps of the decumbrature chart.
Wow.
So I did that, and there was a translation of light, I think, from Mars, which ruled, if I'm remembering correctly, the sixth of illness, and fevers and surgery. He died of a peritonitis.
Wow.
And then the moon had separated from Mars, and then its next aspect was to the ruler of the eighth, exactly 8 degrees. So I assume she looked at that and said, he'll die in about 8 days.
Wow.
And it turns out he did. He died 8 days later, almost to the minute.
Wow. I find that so striking, and it's something that I've been working with rigorously over this past week, and I dare say this entire month, over a number of charts to see with horaries that I've done in the past, how those same horaries would line up when I bring into account the promise of their natal planets and just the parallels, but also the intricacies that occur between the two charts when you do that is really, really profound. And in this method, I've still been taking into account the horary chart for the moment, but after fully analyzing that horary chart for the moment, then I've introduced, or I've brought in, this Evangeline Adams method, and it's really been extraordinary, the things that you can see when you do the two things side by side. And Tony, I saw that you recently made a post regarding the current situation going on with Boris Johnson as well, and how Evangeline Adams might have, or how Evangeline Adams might look at that. Do you want to talk about that for a bit?
I think I've used her method also to see if she would have predicted his illness.
Mm-hmm.
To be honest, I don't recall exactly what I did. I have to go back and I keep moving from one chart to another, so I can't remember what, and trying different techniques. So
yeah. It's cool, you know. This staying at home time is really having all of us doing a fair amount of study, and we're all flipping through charts one after the other, I think. So it's completely fine. Okay, Tony. So today we have an interesting chart to look at. Just a little bit of the background for this chart. This is one of the charts of one of my senior Horary Astrology students, and she received this question from a client of hers regarding the situation that we're going to see. And so it isn't a chart that I have. It isn't a chart for someone who I know personally, and neither is a chart for one of my clients. But she came to me for another opinion after having already given this reading, and it's really interesting the conclusion that both you and I came to, and we're going to take a look at that right now.
So I wrote the question, is there a future with my girlfriend?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, close enough.
Yeah.
I thought it'd be interesting to start with the natal chart of this person. Mm-hmm. Normally we start just with the Horary chart.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've learned from Evangeline Adams is the natal chart's really important. We should, and it doesn't hurt to start with the natal chart to know who is asking the question and what's going on natally.
Mm-hmm.
I did not include any birth data for confidentiality reasons, except to say this is a male. It's a male chart who's asking about his girlfriend. Mm-hmm. This is his birth chart. Mm-hmm. So what I noted was, I made some notes to myself here. Mm-hmm. Since he's going to be asking about a relationship, Saturn as the ruler of the seventh becomes important. Mm-hmm. And Saturn is over here in Virgo retrograde on the cusp of the fourth house. Mm-hmm. And I think it's peregrine there. I think it has no dignity. Mm-hmm. I may be mistaken. This is, let's see, in Virgo.
Yeah, no, Saturn rules.
Right, Saturn is not with dignity. Okay.
Right.
So we have a peregrine retrograde Saturn ruling the seventh cusp and no planets in the seventh. Mm-hmm. So you'd expect this person might have some difficulty cementing a long-term relationship. Mm-hmm. As a possibility. Mm-hmm. I also looked at the moon for a couple of reasons. One is that in a man's chart, traditionally the moon represents the women in his life. Mm-hmm. And so the condition, and also I think in the Horary, I think, but I might be wrong, the moon is the planetary hour lord. I'm not sure. We'll come back to that.
Actually, yes, I think you're right.
So there's probably two reasons I looked at the moon. Mm-hmm. One, because in a man's chart, the moon signifies all the women he's going to have contact with. Mm-hmm. And two, the moon is if it's the hour lord, let me just make sure it is or not.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a Saturn day during a moon hour. He asked the question.
Yes.
So the moon is doubly significant because the moon is what links the natal chart to the Horary chart. It's the lord of the hour. Mm-hmm. Lilly, and traditionally we use the lord of the hour to determine whether the chart is radical. Mm-hmm. Radical meaning it's fit to be read, but radical meaning more fundamentally, there's a root chart. Mm-hmm. And the original root chart is the birth chart. Everything flows from the birth chart. Mm-hmm. And so the moon being the hour lord when he asks the question is the planetary influence that's linking what's going on in his personal life and mind at the time to the birth chart. So the role of the moon becomes crucial to understand.
Mm-hmm. So Tony, just as pretty much a framework for how our listeners can take this method into their actual Horary practice, what you're saying is that whatever the planetary hour ruler is for the Horary moment, it invokes something within that person that goes back to what that planet represents in their birth chart?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of planetary hours is that during the day, there's 24 planetary hours in a 24-hour day. So that roughly each hour, they're not exactly 60 minutes the way we calculate them.
Right.
A new planet dominates the region where you're living.
Right.
And so issues related to that planet come to the forefront of your mind. If the moon is dominating the hour, then women, of course, as a symbol, the moon is a symbol of women in general, come to mind. And in a man's chart, this could be any woman who's influential in his life. Mother, his spouse, his co-workers, whoever, friends. But because the moon is prominent during the hour he asks the question, whatever the moon symbolizes in his birth chart also comes to the fore. So in his birth chart, we see the moon is in the 10th house. So maybe there's some career-related issue that's on his mind. And the moon, I looked at its closest aspect. It's separating from a trine to Uranus and a square to Neptune in that order in very close succession. So whatever those aspects mean for him also come to the forefront.
Wow. Tony, I think that this is really fascinating because in 21st century Horary astrology, it seems as if our appreciation of the planetary hour ruler within the Horary chart has become somewhat impoverished because we don't really hear such a rich use of the planetary hour ruler in the chart as what you're describing now. So I think that people will benefit very greatly from not only hearing today's podcast, but also applying this concept of the planetary hour ruler within their own practice, because I honestly haven't heard it spoken about in this way before now.
Well, I think the way horary is taught is it's a rule. There has to be, the Lord of the hour has to be of the same nature.
Precisely.
Right, as the Lord of the ascendant or something like that.
Yeah.
And that reduces it to a kind of mechanical rule that you can run through a computer and say, yes, it's radical or not. But the theory behind it is that if astrology has any validity, then the Lord of the hour is quite influential. And the questions we ask during that hour are related to that planet. And that's planet's role in our birth chart and the natal promise of that planet in our birth chart. And so those aspects of the natal planet promise come to the forefront. And this is basically the basis of Evangeline Adams' method. She says the promise of the birth chart is always there. To see what becomes most highlighted, you just take the natal planets and put them in the horary wheel. And then that will show you which parts of the birth chart are coming, are most stimulated. So this may be a question about the moon, how his emotional needs are met, especially through women. And we see natally, he gets into these sudden infatuations because Uranus is in the 5th of romance, love affairs. And then almost immediately there's some sort of disillusionment. There's a unrealistic expectation that's not met. The moon squares Neptune. So he gets excited, he gets aroused, he gets attracted. All of a sudden, this is the woman of my dreams.
Precisely.
And then a moment later, damn it, she failed me. It isn't going to work out.
Right.
I was expecting too much. I was over idealizing.
Right.
It was a fantasy that the bubble bursts. And so this is a risk from his birth chart. If he's aware of, he could then realize that women he meets who suddenly seem like this is the one, a moment later, he's going to realize I put her on a pedestal. She's not meeting the needs, emotional needs. And maybe I need to change the way I go about in my relationships. Now, an interesting, again, reading Adams was very influenced by Luke Broughton. And one of his principles was that in female charts, you look at the sun, and in male charts, you look at the moon to see who the person will form a more permanent relationship with. Specifically, the next aspect formed by the sun for a woman or by the moon for a man.
Mm-hmm.
So his moon, the next aspect will be the conjunction to Venus in Aries. So that the type of person he's likely to settle down with will be this Venus in Aries woman. No, I would say an assertive, self-determined woman who does what she wants and puts her needs first.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's peregrine, so that probably it doesn't meet his needs.
Mm-hmm.
Her behavior doesn't meet his needs because it's a peregrine planet in his natal chart that he's attracted to.
Right. Right.
So she's doing her own thing and isn't so concerned about him.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's what I want to say about his natal chart, the importance of the moon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other reason the moon is important is it rules his ascendant. So in a sense, that's who he is.
Right.
Okay. Here's the quote from Broughton that Adams would have used. The first planet the moon applies to in a man's chart describes the first wife. That's what he would say.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the horary chart. This man asks, is there a future with my girlfriend?
Mm-hmm.
And apparently she's just split with him. And he's wondering, will she come back?
Yeah.
And so this is pretty straightforward. It's a Saturn day during a moon hour. So the moon is quite important.
Mm-hmm.
Mars rules the ascendant, that's him. He's asking the question. Venus rules the seventh, that's her.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know how are Mars and Venus related in the chart?
Right.
Well, Venus has conjoined Mars and is now separating.
Mm-hmm.
So she's left him.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not meeting up again. She's gone.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, it's in the sixth house, which is not a great placement in general in Horary. And they're both combust the sun, right? Yeah, 8 to 13.
Right.
So they're both somewhat afflicted by the sun. They're both in Virgo. Mars is peregrine. I don't know, is Venus peregrine in Virgo? Sometimes.
Well, Venus in Virgo, yes, at that degree, because she rules up until the 13th degree, which would be 1259. So yeah,
right. Okay. So neither significator is in great shape. They're both afflicted by combustion, and she's separating from them. So she's left him, and there's no sign they're coming back. If we use the moon as a co-ruler, the moon isn't applying. The moon's an aversion to both these significators. There's no translation of light. One thing I wondered whether, because the moon, because Mars and Venus are both applying to Saturn, could there be a collection of light? In other words, is it possible that Saturn, being the slow planet that will be aspected by trine by the two significators, could someone of the nature of Saturn bring them together again? And so to me, this was really curious because I learned something. I went back to Lilly and read what he said about collection of light. And so I didn't appreciate his definition until I saw this chart. That was good.
So something I wanted to, or something I want to ask you, Tony, just based on this, there's also something within our literature that says that when a planet is combust, any of its future aspects are also pretty much destroyed, basically, or that a combust planet is like a man in prison without hope of liberty. Do you think that the future aspects of this Mars, just because the sun is applying to it, essentially prevents it from being able to form any future aspects, or how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I said, because I just haven't seen enough charts where this was the case.
Right.
And with these old rules, I always like to decide based on a lot of evidence, which was Lilly's method. So that may be true, but I would like to look at a lot of charts, and
Yeah.
it's possible that it's true half the time and
Yeah.
false the other half the time.
Yeah.
And then I would say, well, if it's 50-50, I'm going to throw the rule out.
Precisely.
And the other thing is the sun is moving faster than Mars, so the sun is going to outstrip Mars. And so there'll be a point where sun and Mars are separated enough that Mars will be independent of the combustion. And I think I actually looked at that later in the slides.
Yeah, got it.
So key data. So I just summarized. It's a Saturn day during a moon hour. The moon is in Libra. Oh, I thought that was significant. The hour ruler is not only, it's what determines what's in the ambience at the time. But in this chart, the hour ruler is in Libra, a sign of relationships, conjunct the seventh cusp, a sign of partnerships.
Right.
So it's a radical chart, just based on it clearly.
Right.
We already talked, Mars rules the ascendant as peregrine, Venus rules the seventh, is within orb, but separating from Mars, and she's just separated from him. Oh, I like to look at the 12th part of the ascendant. So here's the chart. So the 12th part, each part is 2.5 degrees.
Right.
So the 12th part would take us to Leo.
Okay.
And the 12th part often shows what's on the querent's mind. So here, the sign Leo rules the 5th house. He has love and romance on his mind.
Precisely.
And I want to look at the ruler of the 12th part. There's nothing in the 5th here. In Leo. Well, that's the sun, and that's causing the combustion of this relationship. So he's thinking about romance that's been scorched romance. And even if I hadn't known the question, I would have said, and this is actually a good way to see if the chart is ready. You say to people before they tell you the question, this looks like it's a 5th house question, something about romance, fun, children, creative projects, love affairs, having to do with they're not working out because the sun is burning the two significators. And you're right on the money if you do that. Okay, so we were talking about the 12th part of the ascendant being in Leo. So it's a 5th house issue on the person's mind. And the ruler of the 5th is scorching, busting the two significators. So this is a relationship that's been torched.
Yeah.
What the question's about. And that is what the question's about. Another sign that this is a radical chart. It really fits the situation, describes it well.
Tony,
Yes.
a question about the Twad. Is our primary source for this Herman of Corinthia and that work that he did on thought interpretation?
Well, I use Mashallah on hidden things. That's my primary source. There are other sources. He probably got it from elsewhere.
Okay.
Awesome. But Mashallah, he gives a really good example in his little essay called On Hidden Things in Ben Dyke's translation.
And just for you all listening out there, the books that we're referring to, or the book that I'm also referring to by Herman of Corinthia, was also translated by Ben Dykes, and it's his work on thought interpretation. It's a wonderful book if you're interested in not only this concept of thought interpretation, but also the basis of what we normally call consultation charts in modern day astrology.
Now in Horary, let's see, I think the next slide I did is the aspects formed by the moon, because in Horary, the moon's aspects are very important. So here is the aspect sequence. The moon is in Libra, which has just entered Libra before the question, right? The question was asked at 9 in the evening. The moon had entered Libra 2 hours earlier. Now, Lilly says that when you have this kind of a sign change before the question, it often correlates with some sort of a significant change in the querent's life prior to the question. So if Lily's right, then not long before the question is when his girlfriend left him, or he became clear that she had left him, that there was some incident in the relationship. Maybe the same day or a day or two before, but it was very close to the time he asked the question. Do you know if that's true? I don't know.
You know, I think that what my student said was that there was shifts going on in the relationship towards her, or towards the girlfriend actually leaving. But truthfully, after I had looked at the chart as well, I figured that the girlfriend had already left. It just took him time to catch up with the realization that she no longer was there. But as far as I know, there were shifts towards her leaving, but she hadn't actively left yet.
So here's the aspect sequence. We have the chart immediately after the question is asked, immediately, like a day later. The next aspect, Venus trines Saturn. And that got me thinking, could Saturn be collecting the light of Venus and holding it till Mars got there? And then could a Saturn-like person bring them together again? Against that, I think, is the fact that Mars is not the next planet to get to Saturn. The moon then squares Saturn. And that is the next aspect of the moon in the chart. So that is not a favorable aspect for how this matter's proceeding. Moon then trines Jupiter, which is nice. The sun then moves on to conjoin Mars. So already there's an aspect to Mars before Mars ever gets near Saturn. And then the moon finally leaves Libra and gets into Scorpio on the 2nd, a couple days later. All right. Will Saturn collect the light of Venus and Mars? So this got me curious. I went back to Lilly and I read his definition very carefully, and to be honest, understood it in a way I hadn't understood it before. So Lilly says, and this is a direct quote, that a collection of light exists when, for people who may not understand collection of light, the idea is that there's a heavy planet like Saturn. It's very slow moving. And two significators that are faster moving are moving toward the planet. And if under the right conditions, that heavier planet will supposedly collect the light of the first significator, hold it. Then when the second significator gets there, it will join the light of the second significator to the light of the first significator, as if they were in aspect. And bring a union of the two planets through the intermediacy of this third heavier planet. And I think in this chart, Saturn's in the 10th, so it could be somebody at work, a boss, an authority figure. Could even, I guess, be a counselor or somebody of stature in their lives. So Lilly says the collection of light exists when, one, the two significators do not behold one another. Behold means are not in orb of aspect, of major aspect. So immediately in this case, because Venus, let me go back here. Venus and Mars, they're separating, but they're in orb of conjunction, right? They're only, 5 degrees apart. That's a conjunction. And actually, they're less than 5 degrees apart. Mars is almost at 9. So they'd be 4.5 degrees apart. Anyone would call that a conjunction. It's a separating conjunction. But they behold one another, because behold means to be in orb of major aspect. So right away, Lilly is saying, if they behold one another, you can't look to collection of light, because the aspect that's in orb is what determines the outcome. He doesn't say that. That's my interpretation. So he's saying, ignore the Saturn, because they're in orb. They're less than 5 degrees apart. They're not getting back together. Their separation will continue. This alone means, no, they're not getting back together. The Venus, the woman, the girlfriend, has left Mars, and she's going. She's much faster. She's getting out of there. And he's back here. And so Lilly, reading between the lines, seems to be saying that if the aspect is in orb, that is the major determinant of the outcome here. So to me, that was interesting. I think there are other authors who say if the planets are separating but applying to a third slower planet, then collection can occur. But Lilly, he's very clear, and he's usually very precise in his wording.
Right.
So there is not going to be a collection of light, according to Lilly.
Right.
But let's assume they were not in orb of one another. Say Venus was a little further away from Mars. They'd been in conjunction, but now Venus is out of orb. Maybe they're 10 degrees apart. Well, then you could look for a collection of light to bring them back together again. Both have to cast their aspects to a more weighty planet. That would be Saturn in this case.
Right.
And that's true in this case.
Right.
And both must receive the weightier planet in one of their dignities. Now, I've seen this written in some texts where the weightier planet must receive the two significators. But and this really struck me that Lilly's saying no. The two faster significators have to receive the weightier planet in a dignity. Okay.
And would that be from the degree that they currently are in, i.e., if Venus is currently in Saturn's term, that sort of thing?
That's a good question. He doesn't specify.
Okay.
I'm assuming that it would have to hold when the aspect perfects. I'm assuming that.
Perfect.
Now here, it doesn't matter a whole lot because Saturn is hardly going to move.
Right. Right.
So the question is, Lilly's idea seems to be that if Saturn is in a dignity of Mars, then Mars feels comfortable leaving his light there because he has his dignity there. Mars can some of his light in a place that he owns. And if Saturn's in a dignity of Venus, Venus is comfortable leaving some of her light there because she owns that space. It's sort of like if you have something valuable,
right,
you're more comfortable leaving it in your house or maybe your locker at school if you're a student because you own that space.
Right.
But you wouldn't want to leave something you value in somebody else's locker because you don't know what will happen to it.
Right.
And so the collecting planet has to be in a dignity of each of the faster planets.
You know, on this point of collection, Tony, I think that Bonatti says something about the collecting planet where he says that the collecting planet also has to be strongly dignified. And three of the things that he said would weaken the dignity of the collecting planet would be if it were cadent, if it were combust, or if it were retrograde. So when we look at the Saturn, we see that the Saturn is retrograde. Do you think that weakens his ability to collect?
Well, if this were a genuine collection, which it isn't, probably. Well, let's look at the dignities of Saturn. We'll get to that's a good point. Let me go back to my dignity table here.
Awesome.
Saturn's in 14 Capricorn.
Yes.
So here's Capricorn. Well, certainly it's in a dignity of Mars, right? Mars is exalted in Capricorn. Is it in a dignity of Venus at 14? No, it's at 13.
13, yeah.
So no, it's not in a dignity of Venus at all. It's strongly in a dignity of Mars. Mars is exalted, and Mars is the Decan ruler. But it's not in a place where Venus has any dignity. So Saturn could comfortably collect the light of Mars, but Venus is not going to leave her light there because she has no dignity there. So there wouldn't be a collection in this case because Venus would be not willing to leave her light in a foreign space that she doesn't own. Now, let's suppose Saturn was in a place. Let's say it was. Oh no, Saturn is 14. I take that back. And 14 is okay. This is the Egyptian terms.
Okay.
Okay, so Saturn has dignity by term, so that there is the possibility of collection here. if they weren't in orb. So I misspoke. I was looking at the 13.
Do you think it has to be in two of the minor dignities, or do you think that just the one dignity by term?
Well, let's see what Lilly says. Where did I put my Lilly? Both cast their aspects to, both receive him in some of their essential dignities. So is the term strong enough?
Right.
It would be better if it were more than the term.
Yeah. Yeah.
The term is like a mid-range dignity. It's not real strong and it's not real weak.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe we'd say there is a possibility of a collection of light, but it's not a strong one. And then finally, going to Bonatti, we would say, let's go back to the chart. There's the chart. So Saturn is in a dignity of both Mars and Venus, has no trouble collecting. Mars is going to be very happy giving Saturn its light.
Yeah.
Venus is going to give maybe a little bit of light because it's term, but there's not a lot of dignity.
Yeah.
Will that be enough?
Yeah.
But then we look at the condition of Saturn. Saturn's really strong here. It's angular. It's almost conjunct the ascendant. Right?
Oh,
the midheaven, I mean.
Yeah.
So we have a really strong and dignified Saturn. It's in Capricorn. So it is retrograde, but I think being angular, almost on the midheaven and in its own home sign, probably overcomes the retrograde status. The other thing, being retrograde, I think is beneficial here because you have a mutual application
between the Saturn and the Venus.
Between Mars, Venus, and Saturn. And usually mutually applying aspects are more powerful. On the other hand, and against this, is that Saturn is a malefic. And it's an out of sect malefic because this is a sun below the horizon. So you have a powerful malefic who is inclined not to work in the querent's best interest because it's out of sect. So I would say if the planets were separated and not in orb of the conjunction, then Lilly would say it's possible but unlikely that a third party could bring them together.
Right.
If the sun were above the horizon, I would think Saturn would be working more toward what the querent wants, and it would be more likely that somebody could bring them together. But I think here, with the Saturn being out of sect, it's less likely. In addition, Saturn conjoins the South Node, which is it's a symbolically a diminution of influence. It represents liberation, dissolution, letting go, basically. So with the South Node prominent, it's the opposite of gain. It's loss. It's something leaving your life that you want, that you're craving for. So I would say in this case, even if it were a genuine collection of light, if it met all Lilly's conditions, Saturn would, as the out of sect malefic, work against what the querent wants, and it would say no. If it were a day chart, I think it would be much more favorable. In addition, I think before Mars got to trine Saturn, the sun would have passed Mars and would have trined Saturn. So there would be several aspects to Saturn
before
Mars did. And this could be a form of what Lilly called prohibition. That is, where you're expecting an aspect to form to make something happen, but one or more aspects gets there first. They may interfere with the ability of the Saturn may be too busy with the light of the sun to do anything when Mars gets there.
Precisely. All right, Tony, this was amazing. Do you want us to take a look at the Evangeline Adams?
Sure, why don't we? Because I didn't put that up. I think I meant to, and for some reason I didn't.
Okay, awesome. So let me get that going. All right, so here we have we're going to be taking a look at the Evangeline Adams Method of Horary Astrology now, that has his natal planets within the cusps of the horary moment.
Okay, so the horary planets are the inner wheel, and Adams just ignored those, and she would just look at the outer wheel, his natal planets, and how they relate to the cusps and angles of this chart. Now, she didn't, Pluto was discovered in 1930, and she died in 32, so she didn't really get to use Pluto. But I wouldn't ignore it because we know about Pluto.
Right. And Tony, what I found interesting in the chart that we just looked at was that you didn't have Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto in that chart. Was that for a particular reason?
Well, I think I was looking at through Lilly. Since I was sticking to Lilly and his ideas about collection of light, I didn't want to put in things he wouldn't have used. That was the only reason.
Perfect. Awesome. So here we do have the outers. We do have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto in this chart as well. And we have Pluto in the 7th. And because this is his natal chart as well, it also is bringing in the natal aspects of his moon Uranus trine, but also of the moon Neptune square.
Right, but so she often started with her horrors looking at what's rising, what's coming into the querent's life, and she looked mainly at the first and second houses. So planets there they were coming up to the horizon. This is what was going to come into his life. So very quickly, Mars in Aries is coming up to his ascendant. So she would say he's in for some sort of contention, fight, argument, Mars-like event. And the Mars is opposite the Pluto in the 7th. Mars is also a symbol of cutting and separation. So that he is facing some sort of Mars-like situation. And let's see.
Tony, do you think that she would use Mars also as a significator of him, or do you think she would specifically use that Mars as a significator of contention and cutting and severances coming up within his life?
She'd use it both ways, but I think she started looking at what's rising in the chart first, because that's what's coming into the life. The sun is also coming up after Mars, sun in Taurus. And the sun here is the 5th house. So maybe there's a romance coming up after this split up.
And what's interesting with that, Tony, is remember in the chart that you just showed, we saw that Leo was the Dwad on the ascendant of that other chart.
Yeah.
And here it is coming up again.
Well, no, it is the same chart. She's using the horary wheel.
But what I'm speaking about is
that the ruler of the 5th is,
precisely that's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It is.
Now she's only going to look at what the sun is doing here. And in his birth chart, the sun, the closest thing is the square to Jupiter, right?
Yeah.
So he is going to experience in the not too distant future some sort of sun square Jupiter, whatever that means for him. Jupiter's right on the cusp of the 5th. So
and it rules his 9th and his 12th.
Right. But since he's asking about relationships, she would focus on Venus here.
Okay.
And maybe also the moon.
Okay.
But let's look at Venus, because specifically that's, will I marry? Venus is peregrine in Aries in the 12th. So that doesn't bode well for them getting together again. The 12th is a house of dissolution, loss, endings, grieving over loss, things like that. Feeling confined and restricted. Sacrificing, not getting what you want.
Right.
So that
Another piece that I think might be interesting, Tony, is the fact that with that Sun square Jupiter, and Jupiter essentially ruling his 12th house, can also bring light to the fact that within the context of his relationships, he oftentimes ends up in a place that feels 12th housey in terms of them being his self-undoing, right? Because we had spoken earlier about the fact how this person really allows himself to be overly generous and overly giving, and even in some ways a bit submissive within the relationships that he's in. And it ties into this story of his 12th house undoing in terms of his relationship history, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just looking again. The Mars is the most striking thing because it's right on the ascendant.
Right.
She would look at all the aspects of Mars. Here, Mars is very closely square his ascendant-descendant axis. So that might well tell her that there's going to be a disruption in a relationship. As Mars advances from 12 to 15, it will square the descendant.
Precisely.
And since Mars is him and the descendant is in his natal chart, is the relationship. He's headed toward a dissolution. In other words, if you think of Mars square the descendant, the seventh cusp, as a possible breakup or trouble in a relationship, Mars is just a degree or so, degree and a half away from the ascendant. So as this chart advances in time, Mars will rise to the ascendant. And what becomes dominant in his life is Mars square his natal descendant.
Right.
The breakup of that relationship preoccupies his life.
Right. I think it's really interesting how this Evangeline Adams method is really in no way negating the story that we had just heard in terms of just looking at the horary by itself, but it's bringing up more highlights to that same story.
Right. So I'm looking at Mars also, because Mars is so prominent because it also rules the eighth cusp. And Uranus is right there in the eighth cusp. So I'm wondering if part of the issue has something to do with her finances or some eighth house matter, some unexpected financial issue that maybe she's dealing with that is related to the breakup. But we just don't know enough of the story.
I think it is interesting, bringing up finances, that in both charts, in the horary chart as well as the natal chart, that Venus is the ruler of the second house. And
the seventh,
So it does seem to already be bringing up some relationship between him, his money, and his partners.
Right.
And in both charts, the Venus is really in a poor condition, because in the horary chart, the Venus is in the sign of her fall, and in the natal chart, the Venus is detriment. So potentially that's also a shading of the situation.
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of details about why she left him, right? We don't.
Right. So this is a story that I remember. It was a while ago, but I do remember that just the overall theme was that she just felt as if she was really uncomfortable. And I think a part of the Venus being in fall in Virgo was, for her, the sky was falling, and that this was an awful relationship. And also, I think the Virgoan part of it was that she started to pick away at every single thing that she didn't like about it. And she just ended up leaving. And as far as we know today, they're still, they haven't resolved anything. They're still not together yet. So I do think that the both charts actually give a sense of her great dissatisfaction with the nature of the relationship. But I do find it interesting how in the horary, all of this is going on within her 12th house. So the radical 6th house, but her 12th house. And in the natal chart, the Venus is showing up in his 12th house. So I find it interesting that there's a 12th house connection between both these charts.
Right. Essentially, when you superimpose the charts, you really see the 6-12 opposition really striking.
Definitely. Definitely. So this is really, really amazing, I think.
Yeah.
Just the way how it brings up this concept or this feeling that every question that we'll ever ask within the course of our lives has already been asked, and how the natal chart really carries with it these answers to all of our questions, even as we move through time, even though it seems like, oh, this question just popped up in my mind yesterday. You showed today, Tony, how
Mm-hmm.
questions don't just pop up, but questions come to us because they're moved from something deeper that's moving or that's activating aspects of our natal chart. And you showed that by virtue of the planetary hours,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is very significant. And if we use that moon that you pointed out was a planetary hour in this chart now, we see that the moon is in the 12th house.
Moon's in the 12th in Pisces.
Right.
And so something about maybe unrealistic emotional assessment of matters is leading to his restricted or confined life and causing some sort of grieving process. Or undoing. I mean, 12th is often undoing. And it's often self-undoing, things he does that lead to results that he doesn't like or that work against him.
Right. And interestingly enough, the moon is there in the house of his self-undoing, as well as Venus representing the partner, also there within the house of his self-undoing, which is probably an indication that that this is a big area for him. Just this concept of what am I doing to myself, and how is what I'm doing to myself impacting not only the type of relationships I'm in, but also the type of people I'm being attracted to be in those relationships with.
And see, if she had used Pluto, which she didn't, I'm wondering how would you interpret this first house Mars opposing seventh house Pluto?
Well, when I think about Mars Pluto, I think about eruptions, and it automatically brings to mind the thought of a volcanic exchange or a volcanic transformation that's going on within the context of their relationship. And so there does seem to be a volcanic breaking apart or a transformation or even dying, because let's face it, Mars has long since, the reason why Mars got all of its associations was because the ancients said it was red like blood and all of that. And Pluto, as we know, has its association with the underworld. And so there is a sense of something that's being severed in a very painful way that may lead to the death of a symbolic death, which I think in the context of this reading is the death of the relationship itself.
Yeah, I also view Pluto as sort of dominance and control in the seventh in relationships. So that may be an issue that's coming to the fore for him. How do I assert myself against this partner who's so dominating or so controlling?
And once again, the Natal Promise shows that Venus representing his relationships in general. And here we see that Venus is not once again, because it will always be in Aries, but
which is Natal Promise,
precisely. So it's showing up very strongly here, and it's wonderful that we have this ability to now see this Pluto in the seventh house, because it's really bringing up a stronger flavoring of how that Venus in Aries is affecting him now within the context of his relationship.
Yeah. So I think the essence of Evangeline Adams' method is by using the natal planets in the Horary wheel, she's saying, at this moment in time, what is the moment highlighting of my natal chart? What parts of my natal chart are really coming to the forefront? What do I need to deal with in my natal chart at this moment? And that's what the Adams Horary is showing.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible. Well, Tony, I think that is about it for this one, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I learned a lot. I like doing this. I always learn something new.
Me as well. All right. Okay, so I hope that you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. And Tony, as always, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really always educational having you around. And I learned a lot today. I learned about how we can use the planetary hours in a richer way within the context of our Horary astrology. And it's always fascinating to see how we not only apply the classical rules of Renaissance Horary astrology from William Lilly, but also how we've been applying these Evangeline Adams methods, because it adds such a richer and nuanced way of connecting all of the information. So I'm really, really grateful for that. So thank you so much, Tony, for that.
Okay, well, I saw it as a learning experience too. So I learned a lot too, so it was very good.
Definitely. And the other thing that I think is really, really special just about what you put together today is that we didn't look at the horary chart in isolation, which I think we sometimes get locked into doing, and view the horary chart as its independent thing, separate and apart from the issues that a person carries around with them within their daily lives. You also started by looking at the natal chart and the way in which this aspect of his life is a potentially challenging area in general. And we carried that singular theme into the body of the horary work that we did, and saw how it showed up in the horary, not just in the chart itself, but also the Evangeline Adams served as a magnifying glass for the same one theme, brought from the natal chart into the horary chart, into the Adams chart. It was really powerful. So thank you for
Very
sharing
well
that.
said. Yeah. Well, basically, the natal chart is the root chart. It's the radix. It is the
Mm-hmm.
radical chart.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Mm-hmm.
horary only makes sense if it resonates with the natal chart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Tony, this was amazing. Thank you as always. And if you guys loved what you saw today, please do like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, the True Divination Podcast, where I do hope that we'll be seeing more of Tony Lewis here to share his expertise. And also, if you guys want to get in contact with me, or you want to pose a question to either Tony or myself, please connect with me via my website, which is www.tarotdharma.com, and I'll put that in the link below, as well as the link to Tony's blog, where if you haven't been following Tony's blog, you need to, because he always puts such well-researched work there. And Tony, can you give us the name of your blog, please?
I think it's just TonyLewisWordPress.com. It's
Okay.
very simple.
Awesome. So I'll also be putting that down in the link below. Once again, thank you guys. We enjoy being here with you. We hope you learned a lot. And until next time, be safe, be healthy, and be blessed.